By the time Daniel Lee leaned in at the end of the night and murmured something in Mandarin about my clothes, I already knew exactly how this story would one day be told. He thought he was safe behind a language he believed I didn't understand. My daughter Chloe laughed softly beside him, the kind of laugh that wasn't really joy so much as wanting to belong. And as their voices slipped into that familiar rhythm of Mandarin, as their eyes flicked over my navy dress and my old shoes, I smiled, turned to his mother, and answered in perfect, unbroken Mandarin in my head. "You have no idea who you're underestimating." But I didn't say it out loud. Not yet. Stories like this need the right moment to turn. The message from Chloe had come the day before when the late afternoon light was slanting across my small kitchen, painting the peeling linoleum in gold. I was sitting at the table where I'd helped her with algebra and college applications, scrolling absent-mindedly through my old emails when my phone lit up. "Mom Daniel wants to take you out to dinner tomorrow night. His family will be there too, 7 p.m. at Golden Dragon. Please dress nice." I read it once then again, my eyes snagging on those last 3 words. Please dress nice. It was such a small sentence, but it landed in my chest like a stone dropped into deep water. I stared at it long enough that my tea went cold, and when I finally typed back, "Of course, honey, I'd love to," my fingers felt clumsy, like I was volunteering for a test I hadn't studied for. I spent the next day treating that dinner like an exam I couldn't afford to fail. At 65 years old, there's a certain kind of quiet inventory you do when you stand in front of your closet. You don't just see clothes, you see years of choices, trade-offs, and paychecks stretched to breaking. I didn't own designer anything not the way Chloe did now, but I had my navy blue church dress, the one that skimmed my knees just right and made me feel like I still remembered how to be graceful. I laid it out on my bed like something sacred and took out the small velvet box from my nightstand. Inside, nestled like tiny moons, was the pearl necklace my mother had given me when I turned 30. I hadn't worn it in years, but that night I clasped it around my neck as if I were fastening a piece of her courage in place. By 3 p.m., I was at the little salon on 5th Street, the one with the flickering sign and the tired magazines, spending $40 to have my hair washed and styled bordered on reckless for my budget. But as the stylist combed careful fingers through my gray strands and coaxed them into soft waves, I let myself imagine Chloe seeing me and thinking just for a moment, "That's my mom, and I'm proud of her." When I got home and slipped into the dress, the pearls cool against my throat, I studied my reflection. I didn't look rich, and I didn't look young, but I looked respectable. Maybe even in a modest way, elegant. It would have to be enough. The Golden Dragon was the kind of restaurant that had always existed on the other side of my life, a place I'd driven past in my old Honda Civic, telling myself, maybe someday, knowing that someday never really came for women like me. Valet attendants in crisp uniforms moved like choreography outside opening doors for people in tailored suits and glittering dresses. The crystal chandeliers inside threw light across polished marble floors, and as I walked in, my shoes gave a small, betraying squeak that seemed to my ears louder than every other sound in the room. I felt like I'd stepped onto a stage in the middle of a performance where everyone else already knew their lines. I saw Chloe before she saw me. She was sitting at a large round table in the center of the dining room, wearing a cream-colored dress that looked like it had walked straight out of some glossy magazine. Her hair was perfect, her lipstick subtle and expensive-looking, and at her side Daniel sat like he belonged in that world of chandeliers and hushed voices. His black hair perfectly styled his suit, the kind that didn't come off department store racks. "Mom," she said, standing to hug me when she finally noticed me approaching. Her arms went around me, but there was a stiffness there, a carefulness in the way she patted my back, as if she were worried I might wrinkle her dress. "Everyone, this is my mother, Maria." The introductions rolled out like a formal ceremony. Daniel's mother, May, wore a burgundy silk dress that shimmered under the lights and enough gold jewelry to catch every glint from the chandeliers. She extended a hand that felt like it had never known dish soap or calluses and said with a thin smile, "So nice to finally meet you in English," while her eyes skimmed my clothes in one quick, assessing sweep. His father, Gian, barely glanced up, murmuring a polite greeting, before his gaze drifted back to the wine in his hand. The other couples at the table smiled with their mouths, and not their eyes, then returned to their own low conversations, leaving me to slip into the empty chair between May and a space that felt more like a buffer than a seat. The menu was mostly in Chinese, with English translations written underneath in small, almost apologetic letters, and as I scanned the prices, my heart lurched. The cheapest dish was $38 more than I usually spent on an entire week of groceries if I was careful. I picked the simplest chicken dish, tracing the characters on the page with my eyes, even as I pretended to frown thoughtfully at the English, like that was all I could read. Around me, orders flowed easily. Multiple courses, bottles of wine dishes pronounced in fluent Mandarin and accepted without anyone glancing at the cost. That was when the first small cut landed. May leaned slightly toward Daniel, her voice dropping as she spoke in Mandarin, her hand making a tiny dismissive gesture toward my dress. "She looks like she bought that from a discount bin for poor people." She murmured the words, sliding clear and sharp into my ears. Daniel smirked, responding in the same language, "Relax, Mom." Chloe warned me her mother doesn't know how to dress for places like this. Their eyes flicked over me, then away, as if I were an object on the table rather than a person sitting between them. I felt my face warm, but I kept my expression gentle, tilting my head as if I were simply curious about their exchange. "What are you two talking about?" I asked lightly in English. Chloe glanced up from her phone and said, "Oh, nothing, Mom. Just the food," before looking away again. Inside, something fragile shifted, but I said nothing. They thought the language was their shield. They had no idea it was my old home. As the evening unfolded, English floated over topics like the weather and the wedding venue, but every time the conversation turned sharper, more personal, it slipped back into Mandarin, as fluid to them as breathing. I listened as May critiqued the way I held my chopsticks, telling the table. She holds them like a child. Maybe Chloe never taught her. And Daniel added, laughing. "She looks like a cleaning lady trying to dress up for a fancy party." Each sentence landed like a sting, not because I couldn't handle an insult, but because my daughter was sitting right there smiling along, letting the words wash over her without protest. I excused myself at one point and walked to the restroom, gripping the edge of the sink as I stared at my reflection under unforgiving lights. You knew this world once I reminded the woman in the mirror, the former consulate translator, hidden under DMV exhaustion and secondhand clothes. You speak their language better than they think. Don't you dare let them take your dignity, too. I smoothed my dress, lifted my chin, and walked back to the table, already feeling the first threads of a decision weaving together in the back of my mind, a decision that would change everything for all of us. When I returned to the table, the conversation had drifted back into polite English, orbiting around wedding venues, honeymoon destinations, and guest lists. I tried gently to contribute, mentioning a small botanical garden Chloe had loved visiting as a child, but my words sank into the tablecloth like drops of water falling onto stone. Daniel didn't even look at me when he said, "Oh, Mrs. Alvarez, you don't need to worry about any of that. We have everything handled." He called me Mrs. Alvarez with the tone of a man correcting an employee, and the "we" in his sentence was heavy, sealing me outside their circle with quiet finality. I smiled anyway, because smiling is what mothers do when they're trying not to crumble in front of their children. The night eventually wound down in a scattered flurry of check signing and sleek coats being lifted from the backs of chairs. Outside in the crisp night air, the Lee family clustered near Daniel's shining BMW, a picture of curated elegance. My old Honda Civic sat alone under a flickering street lamp, looking smaller than I remembered. Daniel walked me to it with that polished politeness he wore like a second suit, leaning in once we reached my car. "Thank you for coming tonight, Mrs. Alvarez. Chloe is lucky to have a mother who keeps things simple." He paused, letting the insult breathe between us like smoke. "Have a good night." I drove home in silence, hands tight on the steering wheel, the city lights stretching long and blurred through the windshield. Every Mandarin sentence they had spoken replayed in perfect clarity in my mind, each one landing sharper than the last. Little did they know those words were hitting the ears of someone who had once translated diplomatic negotiations, mediated cultural disputes, and bridged worlds that did not speak to each other naturally. I had given up that life when Chloe was 12, when her father walked out with his suitcase and left behind an apartment full of unpaid bills and the weight of everything we suddenly couldn't afford. The consulate job required long hours, nights, weekends, things a single mother couldn't give. So I took a job at the DMV for stability, sacrificed ambition for motherhood, and promised myself Chloe would never feel the emptiness her father left behind. Yet there I was, standing in my kitchen in that same navy dress, staring at my cold tea. While replaying the moment, Chloe nodded silently as Daniel told his mother in Mandarin, "Don't worry, she's embarrassed of her mom too. Once we're married, she'll keep her distance. My Chloe, my bright, capable girl." I pressed a hand to my chest as if I could push back the ache spreading there. I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser later that night, pulling out the wooden box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were the fragments of my former life certificates, letters of recommendation, photos of me shaking hands with dignitaries, speaking at cultural events, translating for people who needed a voice where theirs couldn't reach. I ran my fingers over one photograph of my younger self, smiling with unapologetic confidence. That woman felt distant, but not gone. Days passed slow and heavy. Chloe called at noon the next day, her voice carrying that strange brightness of someone performing happiness. "Thank you for coming last night, Mom," she said. "Daniel's parents really liked you." The lie was so fragile I could hear the strain in her tone. She added hesitantly, "I just wanted to mention, his family is traditional, and if we have events together, maybe just let me know what you're planning to wear next time. They're very particular," I murmured. Of course, because calling out her shame in that moment would only bruise us both more deeply. But something inside me had shifted. A small, still spark of resolve began taking shape, fueled by years of quiet strength and the ache of watching my daughter shrink herself to fit into a world that didn't deserve her. I spent evenings after work researching Daniel's family, their restaurants, their business network. I expected to find nothing more than tax documents and old news articles. Instead, I found interviews praising the Lee family's traditional values, photos of Daniel with a rotating cast of elegant women at galas, and a few whispers blogs, comments, rumors hinting at past marriages that had ended abruptly. 2 weeks after that dinner, I stood outside Chen's Golden Palace, the Lee family's flagship restaurant. The ornate red and gold facade gleamed in the sunlight, and the parking lot brimmed with luxury cars. I told myself I was only there to look to understand the world Chloe was so desperate to join. But then I saw it, a help-wanted part-time hostess sign in the window. Something clicked sharply inside me. I stepped through the doors before I could overthink it. The interview lasted 15 minutes. May herself asked me to introduce myself in Mandarin, likely expecting me to stumble. Instead, I answered with polished fluency, watched surprise flicker across her immaculate face, and knew instantly that I had given her something she couldn't quite categorize. She hired me on the spot for weekends. I smiled graciously, even as I felt the threads of a plan knitting themselves into something deliberate and sharp. Working there, I became invisible in the way people make older women invisible without even noticing. I carried menus, wiped tables, greeted guests, and listened. Every Mandarin conversation around me flowed easily, freely, soaked in the certainty that I understood none of it. But I understood all of it, and it was worse than I imagined. One night, while I wiped down a back table, I heard Daniel answer a phone call he assumed no one else could comprehend. "Yes, the wedding is still on schedule," he said in English, his tone low and amused. "She doesn't suspect anything." Then he switched to Mandarin, and the real story spilled out like poison. He spoke of Chloe as naive, of using her savings, of discarding her once his paperwork cleared. He mentioned another woman, Yuting from Shanghai, the one he was actually committed to. And he said, "Her mother is even more pathetic. She'll do anything to feel accepted." It's almost entertaining. I nearly dropped the cloth in my hand. I kept listening even when the words carved into me like blades. And when I walked to the break room minutes later, the truth settling cold and certain in my bones, I made one final decision with absolute clarity. I wasn't going to warn Chloe immediately. I wasn't going to run to her in tears or anger because she was already under their spell. She wouldn't see the truth, not yet. Instead, I would stay, listen, document, and wait for the one moment they didn't see coming. Over the next month, I moved through the restaurant like a quiet shadow, carrying menus and teapots, while absorbing every conversation they never imagined I could understand. The Lee family's Mandarin drifted freely across dining rooms, hallways, staff corridors, each sentence revealing more than the last. They didn't hide anything, because to them, I wasn't someone capable of knowing or remembering. I was a harmless older woman with soft hands, a tidy smile, and no place or power in their world. They had no idea I had once sat across from diplomats deciphering subtleties that could sway negotiations. They had no idea that their arrogance was the very thing tying the noose around their own necks. Patterns began to take shape. Half-finished sentences from Daniel, offhand remarks from May, quiet exchanges between Jian and his relatives, they all wove into a disturbing tapestry. The Lees weren't just manipulating Chloe, they had done this before. Twice. I pieced together their history almost like an investigator gathering scraps of information from conversations they assumed were private. Hannah Carter, Megan Blake, two American women who had each married Daniel in the past, each leaving him quietly afterward with vague explanations about irreconcilable differences. May described the first one as easy to control, and the second as too emotional but predictable, once cornered. Jian murmured about timelines, paperwork, and clean exits. And somewhere in the middle of these fragmented remarks, I heard one detail that changed everything. Both marriages ended just after Daniel's green card paperwork had advanced to favorable stages. This wasn't coincidence. This was a system, a strategy, a family business model. And Chloe was next. I felt sick, but I didn't stop listening. One evening, as I set teacups on a tray, I overheard May telling a visiting aunt that the girl, meaning Chloe, was impressionable, overly eager to please, and that once Daniel had what he needed, she would leave quietly the way American women do after they're told they weren't enough. The aunt asked something softly, and May replied, "We document everything. If she resists, we make it look like she was unstable. That's what worked the last 2 times." My hand tightened so suddenly around the teapot handle that I nearly cracked the porcelain. I needed more information, more proof, and above all, I needed to know who these other women were. So during my lunch breaks, I searched. I found staff directories, old marriage records, license changes. Hannah Carter had moved back to Oregon, working now as a teacher in a small town. Megan Blake was living in Arizona, working at a clinic under her maiden name. My heart pounded as I drafted careful, cautious emails asking each woman if they'd be willing to share experiences that might help protect someone else. They both replied within days. Hannah's story broke something inside me. She still sounded fragile on the phone, her voice soft and hesitant, as if speaking too boldly might make the past resurface and devour her again. They made me feel like I was nothing without them, she confessed. Like my job, my background, even my personality were flaws. By the time I realized what they were doing, I thought I was the problem. I signed the divorce papers that same day and disappeared. Megan's voice, in contrast, carried a tremor of anger beneath the surface sharpened by surviving what the family tried to do to her. When she told me I documented everything, I nearly wept with relief. She had recordings, screenshots, bank statements, emails, evidence of Daniel coordinating plans with Yuting overseas during their marriage. Notes of May's emotional manipulation, even private conversations where Daniel discussed draining her finances. I didn't know what to do with it back then, she admitted. I was too traumatized. But if you're asking for it to help someone else avoid what I went through, yes, I'll share it. That night, after Chloe called me sounding exhausted and strangely hollow, describing how May had been teaching her to adjust her personality to be a proper wife, I realized the manipulation had reached deeper than I feared. She told me she needed to be less independent, that Daniel should control their finances because he understood money better, and that American women are too self-focused to understand harmony. Hearing my daughter repeat the Lee family's poison so faithfully made my blood run cold. But it also confirmed that confronting her now would push her further into their arms. I needed to let the truth surface in a way she couldn't deny. Then came the announcement of the engagement party. 60 guests, hosted by the Lee family, red and gold decorations, a hired photographer, a carefully orchestrated event meant to publicly cement the illusion of Daniel and Chloe's perfect relationship. It was the moment I had been preparing for. The week leading up to the party, I organized every piece of evidence Megan had sent, every recording I had captured at the restaurant, every confirmation from immigration attorneys I'd consulted. I bought a small recording device and placed it discreetly in my purse. I practiced quietly what I would say if the right moment came. On the night of the engagement party, I dressed exactly as May expected. Quiet, gray, modest nothing that drew attention. From every angle, I looked like the same obedient, understated woman they believed they could manipulate without resistance. Inside, the Golden Dragon lanterns glowed warm and soft, flickering across the crowd of elegantly dressed guests. The air buzzed with Mandarin laughter and the confidence of people who believed their secrets were secure. Chloe stood near Daniel, smiling that brittle smile again, looking thinner than the last time I'd seen her. When May introduced her to guests, she did so as if Chloe were an accessory describing her potential to grow and willingness to learn how to serve Daniel properly. Every word made Chloe shrink just a little more, and then the toasts began. Daniel stood at the center of the room, champagne glass lifted, charming, and confident. He thanked his parents, praised Chloe in English with phrases like, grateful to have found someone so devoted, then smoothly transitioned into Mandarin, and everything shifted. His tone sharpened, his posture relaxed, and the real Daniel emerged. Thank you for your patience, he told his relatives. I know it is difficult to watch me pretend to love this simple American girl, but sacrifices must be made. Laughter rippled through the room. Chloe stood beside him, smiling, unable to understand a word. And when Daniel raised his glass in my direction and said I had been pathetic, eager to humiliate myself for their approval, something inside me, quiet, steady, and unbreakable, rose to the surface. This was my moment. I stood slowly and 50 pairs of eyes turned toward me. In perfect Mandarin, clear enough to cut through every layer of noise, I said, "That was an interesting speech, Daniel." Silence hit the room like a dropped chandelier. His face drained of color. May's glass slipped from her fingers. Gian rose so quickly he knocked over his chair. I had their attention, and I wasn't stopping now. For a moment, no one breathed. The clink of May's shattered glass still echoed faintly across the lacquered floors, and Daniel stood frozen, his champagne flute, suspended mid-air as if he'd forgotten how to lower it. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of their shock settle across the room like dust, drifting after an explosion. Then I took a single step forward, feeling decades of swallowed dignity, quiet strength, and a mother's unwavering love gather behind my voice. Still speaking in flawless Mandarin, I said I especially enjoyed the part where you described using my daughter for her money and discarding her once your immigration papers were approved. Whispers swept through the room like wind threading through dry leaves. Several of Daniel's relatives exchanged startled glances. A few of them even stepped subtly away from him as though proximity might incriminate them by association. Daniel opened his mouth, closing it again like a man drowning too quickly to form a plea. Chloe was staring between us in growing horror, her face draining of color, as realization dawned, first confusion, then fear, then a betrayal so sharp it made her look fragile enough to break. I continued calmly the way I had once spoken during tense diplomatic sessions, my tone steady, controlled, and devastating. For 2 months I've been listening, recording, collecting the evidence you were foolish enough to hand me freely. I reached into my purse and lifted the thick folder I had brought. Its edges perfectly aligned the papers inside, compiled with surgical precision. Your previous marriages, I said, flipping open a page to Hannah Carter and Megan Blake, conveniently timed, abruptly ended, financially devastating to the women you left behind. My voice never wavered as I added, and now your fiancé waiting in Shanghai Yutingjiao, the woman you plan to bring here after my daughter is discarded. Gasps rippled outward like concentric circles in a pond. The older aunt, who had been praising Daniel earlier, placed a trembling hand over her chest. The photographer lowered his camera slowly, as though afraid capturing this moment might implicate him in witnessing a crime. Chloe whispered barely audible, "Mom." "What is this?" Her voice cracked, and Daniel finally found his own, reaching out to her with a trembling hand. "Chloe, baby, don't listen to this. She's confused. I cut him off with nothing more than a cold look. "Daniel," I said softly, "you forget I worked 12 years at the Chinese consulate. You forget I built bridges between governments for a living. You forget I hear every inflection, every lie, every shift in intention. I can translate your soul if you give me enough words." A murmur of stunned approval stirred among a few guests. Even those who disliked me were now watching me like someone watching a dam crack. May found her voice then sharp and trembling. "You are twisting everything. These are cultural misunderstandings. You're trying to sabotage the marriage out of jealousy." She switched from Mandarin to English to appeal to the wider crowd. "She's unstable. She's making outrageous accusations because she cannot accept that her daughter is marrying up. If she expected sympathy, she didn't receive it. People were backing away from her now, watching her with wary eyes, the air buzzing with tension. I held her gaze as I replied in Mandarin, "I have your conversations recorded, May. All of them. Including the ones where you explained exactly how you train American daughters-in-law to abandon their independence and hand over their finances. Including your plans to make Chloe believe she was the problem when Daniel left her." Daniel's voice cracked through the tension like a brittle twig. "Stop this. Stop talking." He turned to Chloe, forcing out a desperate, trembling laugh as he said, "She's insane, Chloe. She's making things up. My love, we both know your mother struggles." I stepped closer. "Finish that sentence," I said quietly. "Finish it. Call me mentally unstable in front of 60 witnesses after calling me pathetic in Mandarin for weeks. I dare you." His jaw snapped shut. I turned to Chloe, then not as a performer addressing a crowd, but as a mother speaking directly to her child. My voice softened even as tears pressed hot against my eyes. "Sweetheart, Daniel doesn't love you. He never did. Everything you've been feeling, every moment you doubted yourself, every time they made you feel small, that wasn't your fault. They planned it. They crafted it. They knew exactly how to break you. Chloe looked at Daniel, then back at me. "Tell me she's lying," she whispered, her voice raw. "Tell me, Daniel." Daniel stepped forward, reaching for her hand. "Chloe, of course But his words stopped when I lifted my phone and pressed a single button. The audio played clearly Daniel's voice from one of the back hallway recordings saying, in Mandarin, "Once I get my green card, I'll get rid of her. She's served her purpose. She's naive enough to believe this is love." The room erupted not in chaos but in a stunned collective silence so thick it felt suffocating. Chloe staggered back. "Get away from me," she said softly, then louder voice shaking, "Get away from me." She shoved his hand away and moved behind me as though realizing I had been the shield she didn't know she needed all along. Daniel lunged forward, but Jian grabbed his arm, hissing something sharp in Mandarin, something that sounded like, "You fool, she trapped all of us." May collapsed into a chair, muttering frantic, disjointed phrases about lawyers and misunderstandings. I turned once more to the room. "I've already spoken with immigration attorneys," I said, projecting my voice so every guest heard me clearly. "Everything Daniel and his family have done is part of a documented pattern of marriage fraud, financial exploitation, and emotional abuse." I paused, letting the gravity sink in, and this time it ends. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth was loud enough. Within 48 hours, investigations began. Papers were filed, calls were made, and the life Daniel had built on manipulation began collapsing with stunning speed. But the most important moment happened 3 days later in my kitchen at 7 a.m., when Chloe arrived with a suitcase, tear-streaked and trembling, saying, "Mom, I'm so sorry. How did I not see any of it?" I gathered her in my arms the way I had when she was 12, when the world first split open under her feet. She cried into my shoulder, grieving not just Daniel, but the version of herself that had believed she needed to shrink, to feel worthy of love. I kissed her hair and whispered, "You didn't see it because you were taught not to see your own value. But I always did, and now you will too." In the weeks that followed, Chloe reclaimed her life piece by piece. She cut financial ties, recovered the money she could, and rebuilt her confidence slowly, like someone learning to breathe again after holding her breath for too long. Daniel's visa application was denied. His plans with Yuting evaporated when the scandal reached their community, and the Lee family's business faced scrutiny that exposed years of buried wrongdoing. As for me, I went back to my small house, my modest clothes, my DMV job, but I carried myself differently. Not because I had changed, but because I had finally remembered who I'd always been. And Chloe remembered too. She came to dinner every Sunday. We talked for hours. We healed. And one quiet evening as we washed dishes side by side, she said softly, "Mom, you didn't just save me. You reminded me where I come from, and I'll never forget that again." Stories like this don't end with fireworks. They end with clarity, with reclaimed strength, and with the quiet certainty that love, real love, never requires shrinking. If you've watched this far, thank you for staying with me. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me what would you have done in my place. Your stories matter more than you know.